Here now.
Thank you for coming. This is our third climate conversations event for this 2025-2026 winter season. Thank you all for coming. I'm John Zittel. I'm one of the co-chairs of our Climate Action Commission here in Bath. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Patten Free Library for hosting us here, Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, and the Mockingbird Book Club. Before we start, I have a couple of little admin items that I need to take care of. First of all, mark your calendar for some of our upcoming events. On March 11th, we'll have an event where we'll be hearing about the work of some student teams from 3 universities, all sponsored by a philanthropic initiative by the name of Envision Resilience. They visited Bath this past year, and they'll be offering urban landscape and architecture design ideas for adaptive and resilient futures here in Bath. They'll also be mounting an exhibit of their work here at the library. That'll go up around March 10th. The exact date isn't quite certain yet, and will be up through the summer until the end of August. Following that, on April 8th, we'll have an emerald ash borer event being done in cooperation with the Bath Community Forestry Committee. If you haven't already, you'll find a sign-up sheet at the back of the room if you'd like to sign up if you're not already on our mailing list. And you'll also find some sheets that look like this that you can fill out if you like, that give you the chance to weigh in on topics of interest, things that you'd like to see in future climate conversations. We also, as I'm sure you saw as you came in, we have copies of this evening's book available for purchase, courtesy of Terry Shirts from the Mockingbird Bookshop here in Bath. Tonight's presentation and discussion will be recorded, so you and your friends can all view it again on the library's YouTube channel if you like. Also warn you, if you choose during the discussion to make any comments to the person sitting next to you, the microphones will pick them up.
Oh, geez, great.
So be warned. We'll start this evening with a presentation from our guest speaker and follow that with a Q&A session. We're in a hybrid session with attendees both here in person and on Zoom. For those that are on Zoom with us, if you have any questions, you can submit them through the chat function, and Ruth here will be helping us keep track of those. The library has a prompt closing time at 7 p.m. So we'll try to plan to wrap up by about 6:45, give you those last few minutes for goodbyes to your neighbors. If you want to pick up an autographed copy of the book, that'll all be available. Now, let me make just a couple of quick remarks about this evening's presentation. If you pick up any scientific journal today, you're likely to find an editorial about the need to do better at communicating science to the public. Most of those editorials are in the vein of scientists need to do a better job of explaining what they do. But regardless of what you may think you know about Einstein or Darwin, science isn't about the work of individual scientists. Scientific knowledge is really the result of many minds refining and testing ideas over generations. And those are really hard stories to tell. But yet, rarely do scientists ask how they can partner with storytellers, and that's a pity. Our guest this evening is a great storyteller. That may sound gratuitous, since he uses the word story twice in the title of his book. But I mean it sincerely. As I began reading his book, within the first few pages, I started muttering to myself. I was asking myself questions like, why is he explaining it this way? It's not how I would have done it. But in case after case, I decided that his was the better way to explain really complicated subjects. He's a born science educator, more formally a science journalist, and he's a masterful storyteller. And he has a very ambitious story to tell us about tonight. Possibly the biggest story in the history of Earth, because it is the story of the 4 billion year story of geology, of the carbon cycle, and of the emergence and evolution of life on Earth. Sometimes life was the driving force, and at other times geologic forces were the driver. But it's all necessary context for understanding the last 2 centuries of fossil fuel use and what it means for all of us. The book is the story of CO2, it's the story of everything, and the author is Peter Brannen. I'll ask Peter to tell us a little bit more about himself when he comes up here. Please welcome me, join me in welcoming him to Bath and to our climate conversations.
Well, that was such a good introduction. I think we're done here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. This is really inspiring, seeing this many people come out of hibernation in the middle of winter to hear a talk about carbon dioxide. So I'm very appreciative for the invitation. So to tell you a little bit about myself and sort of how I ended up writing a story that's about basically all of Earth history and how CO2 figures into that. I am a science journalist and I write about deep time and paleontology and paleoclimatology. So what we can understand about the future of climate change from studying Earth's deep past. So the previous book that I wrote about the big 5 major mass extinctions that ever happened in Earth history. And I spent a few years hanging out with paleontologists who were sort of going out to rock outcrops and doing fancy stuff in their labs and sort of teasing apart the story of what actually went wrong in sort of these worst moments ever. And the reason why I wrote that story is because I noticed in the geoscience community, sort of the story had moved on from what most people were familiar with, which is, the one about the dinosaurs and the asteroids, which accounts for one of the major mass extinctions. But in the past 30 years, as paleontologists went out to previous mass extinctions, some of which were way worse than the one that killed off the dinosaurs, and they looked for evidence of an asteroid impact, they didn't find it. And instead what they found were these really dramatic climate events driven by some of the same sort of forces that we're meddling with today. So there's sort of this eerie cautionary tale in Earth history about what can happen when CO2 goes out of control on the surface of the planet. But that book sort of talked about CO2 in the same context that I feel like a lot of people here are familiar with, which is that it makes it a lot warmer and it's, you often hear about it as this industrial pollutant that comes out of smokestacks and makes it warmer and acidifies the ocean and does all this horrible stuff. So this is how much CO2 we produce every year. As you can see, it's still going up. We put out about 40 gigatons of it every year into the atmosphere, which is just a crazy amount. It's about 100 times more than all the volcanoes on Earth. And I'll get into why that's kind of important as well. But I realized in the course of writing the previous story, which I don't think I mentioned the name of it, but it's called The Ends of the World. That was my previous book. There's this way you read about CO2 in the news that it is this stuff that comes out of smokestacks. It's very scary. It's an industrial pollutant like other ones we've had, like CFCs or mercury. And so, it's just another one of these sort of bad things. And when you hang out with geoscientists who try to figure out how the planet works, you realize that CO2 is sort of at the center of a lot of these stories. So I wanted to pull back from the news headlines and, reintroduce people to this thing that they'd read about in the news as sort of fundamental to how the planet works. Because the operation and maintenance of the planet really is this thing called the carbon cycle, which over hundreds of millions of years, CO2 comes out of volcanoes, it goes into the oceans and atmosphere. Some of it goes into life and then back into the Earth's crust. Then hundreds of millions of years later, it comes back out of volcanoes. And this really is what keeps the planet habitable. So it's bad right now that there's CO2 going into the air and it's making the planet warmer, but in other ways, it makes the planet habitable. So it has kept a habitable temperature for the planet for the past 500 million years at least. It's a good thing that there's some of it in the atmosphere. If you took all the CO2 out of the atmosphere tomorrow, the temperature would drop by something like 60 degrees Fahrenheit in a half century. The oceans would freeze to the tropics. So that would obviously be very bad. It would also, because CO2 is, it would be amazing if just one, gas on the planet was that important to the planet, but it also has this other feature that CO2 is literally the stuff of life. So you might have heard that life on Earth is carbon-based, and the source of that carbon is CO2, which enters the living world through photosynthesis. Plants take CO2 in, and they pull off this magic act by using sunlight to basically turn it into the stuff of life, organic matter, so plant matter, and the rest of us eat it and sort of feed off of that incredible magic trick. So as I said, if just one gas did this, did one of these things, either maintained a habitable temperature for all of Earth history. I don't suppose there's any water anywhere. Sorry. Yeah. Or it was literally the stuff that all life is made out of. That would be amazing enough. And my book sort of weaves together these two stories, that it is fundamental to how the planet works. And this is why you don't really want to mess with it that much, that because it's so important to the operation and maintenance of the planet, that when it gets really out of control, you have these really gnarly episodes in Earth history when lots of stuff dies. And so I think you're told as a writer generally not to quote a better writer than you, but I kind of couldn't help it, because there's this guy, Primo Levi, who some of you might be familiar with. He was an Italian chemist who was sent to Auschwitz in World War II, and he wrote this incredible book in, reflecting on his experiences called The Periodic Table. And he describes carbon dioxide as yeah. Well,
I wonder if the plug came out, Peter.
did it? Sorry, guys. Well, once this warms back up, I can, there we go, okay. He calls it carbon dioxide, this gas which constitutes the primary material of life, the permanent store that every growing thing draws on, and the ultimate destiny of all flesh, is not one of the principal components of air, but rather a ridiculous scrap, an impurity. The air contains 0.03%, and I have 0.03 there in asterisks, because right now it's up to about 0.04% since he wrote this. This, on the human scale, is an ironic feat of acrobatics, a juggler's trick, an incomprehensible display of omnipotence and arrogance, since it is from this constantly renewed impurity in the air that we come, we animals and plants, we human species, with our 4 billion discordant opinions, our millennia of history, our wars, our shames, and nobility and pride. So he really kind of says it, best there. And since this is a book about the geologic history of Earth, I sort of like to begin talks by reminding people of just what these timescales mean. Thank you. Because, with our primate brains, we're not really evolved to think on geological timescales in the same way that like distances in space are too big for us to sort of intuitively understand. I think we also don't commonly appreciate that we're sitting on top of this like ocean of deep time underneath us. And so geologists have these ways of sort of picturing how long this span is. And my favorite one that I've used in this book and in the previous book was that if you imagine you go for a walk and every footstep you take is a century, and you try to imagine, okay, how long does that take to get back to the beginning of Earth history? You take one footstep and it's 1926, and World War I ended recently, and the Ottoman Empire disbanded a few years ago after 500 years. And there's a third fewer coral reefs, and the night side of the planet's very dark because a lot of the world hasn't been electrified yet. And so that's one step. You take 20 more footsteps and you're before the Roman Empire. World's totally different, obviously. You haven't walked very far. Then 200 footsteps past that, things really start to change dramatically. The sea level is 400 feet lower than it is today. There's about a mile of ice on top of us. There's an Antarctica's worth of ice on top of North America. There's lions and camels and giant ground sloths in North America. So you barely walked outside the room, and the planet has been totally transformed. So then you start to get this intuition, okay, well, if it's that far to see all these changes, then maybe it's, a couple more miles to the dinosaurs and then a couple more miles to the trilobites, whatever. But by the end of the night, surely you will have, covered all of Earth history. But in fact, to cover this whole span, you'd have to walk for 20 miles a day for almost 4 years. So we're really not used to thinking about time on these scales. And sort of an eerie feature of the fossil record is that the entire age of animal life, everything we sort of recognize as animals, is only in the last 10% or so of Earth history. So just the very end, sort of in Earth's old age, you get this recognizable life on the planet. So basically every thing you see in a natural history museum, other than some of the asteroids and stuff, basically is in this last bit of Earth history. And whereas life probably started around 4 billion years ago. So there is this sort of eerie delay of the biosphere. Like, why did it take life so long to get sort of off the ground? And I explore some of the reasons for that in the book. I bring the story in my book all the way back here to the origin of life around 4 billion years ago, which I didn't plan on doing originally, but I was hanging out at the University of Colorado Boulder Geoscience Department, and for a couple of years, I lived out in Boulder, and they invited this guy, this very quirky geoscientist, Mike Russell, to come and give a talk. And he started his talk by polling the audience, and he said, "What is life's job? What does life do?" And this is a guy who studies the origin of life, and people raised their hands and gave these very sort of like, I don't know, Carl Sagan kind of answers, where they'd say, "Oh, life is the universe looking back at itself." And he sort of just dismissed all these out of hand. And then he kind of let the air out of the room when he said, "No, life's job is to hydrogenate carbon dioxide." So I was like, great. And he said, life takes in CO2 and it turns it into the stuff of life, and everything you eat is CO2, and you're made out of CO2, and everything you're sitting on is CO2. And since the origin of life, if it's all story of CO2, then the story of the origin of life is a story of CO2 as well. And so I was working on this book at the time, and I sort of like dreaded this because I was like, oh great, I'm gonna have to have a chapter on this stuff because the geochemistry of this stuff is really gnarly. But his thinking was that, you know, there is this reaction he's talking about that plants do today where they take in CO2 and they make life out of it, which is kind of miraculous. And since life emerged from a planet without life, he figured there must be somewhere on the planet where this reaction that doesn't really happen today outside of the presence of life must have happened somewhere on the planet where conditions were just perfect. And he actually hypothesized the existence of this very particular kind of hydrothermal vent called an alkaline hydrothermal vent. And he said, this probably should exist somewhere if we study the oceans. And if it does, then the conditions are perfect, uniquely perfect for just sort of pumping out the stuff of life. And then eventually geology kind of becomes biology, but you really need it to get started somewhere. And sure enough, 10 years later or so, a team at the University of Washington found exactly the kind of vents he was hypothesized. And I interview in the book this lady, Susan Lang, at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, who goes down in Alvin, the submersible, some of you might have heard of it, like discovered Titanic and did all sorts of cool stuff. And, you couldn't pay me enough to do this, but she goes down to these vents and looks for exactly these sort of chemicals that are fundamental to life. And she has found them. So these compounds that are at the heart of all metabolism of everything on Earth today, whether you're bacteria or elephant, is just sort of being made for free, getting pumped out of these vents. So it's kind of this amazing story. Obviously, there's a big yada yada going on between that and like the rest of the biosphere that's happened since then. But there's at least a plausible map from here to there. And life's been wildly successful since maybe it started at the bottom of the ocean. But it is amazing, even like the high school biology that you learn with like mitochondria and stuff. The more you study the chemistry of these vents, like you kind of keep this chemistry within you, like in all of your cells. There's ways that it is like shockingly similar to what's going on in the vents. Okay, so that's the life side of the story. As I said in the book, I sort of weave these two stories where one is its role as the sort of substrate of all life, CO2. And as if that wasn't amazing enough, there's also this other amazing feature of it, that it is as a landmark paper wrote a while ago, principal control knob governing Earth's temperature. But this is not new science. In the 1860s, CO2's role as a greenhouse gas was independently discovered by an American scientist, Eunice Foote, and this Irish physicist, John Tyndall. And then in 1896, this Swedish guy, Svante Arrhenius, he calculated that if you doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, the planet would warm by about 5 degrees C, which is like on the outer edge of the range of our like best supercomputers. And this was in 1896. So despite what you've heard about the science kind of being in doubt, like this is about as well-established science as you get in the earth sciences. So as I said at the beginning, it's a good thing that some CO2 comes out of or that there's some CO2 in the atmosphere, because otherwise the planet would freeze over. And when humans aren't around, the source of this is out of volcanoes, which emit it sort of, steadily sort of puff it to the atmosphere from volcanoes on land, but also mid-ocean ridges, so volcanoes underwater, at a rate that's 1/100th of the rate that we put it into the atmosphere today. And it doesn't just accumulate and cook the planet and turn us into Venus, because the Earth also has these other processes that bury it, are very good at scrubbing it out of the atmosphere, burying it somewhere else on the planet. And the primary one over geological time spans is this one that I feel like people are not, it's not that well, I don't know, broadly known, or I feel like it's not appreciated maybe because it sounds so boring, but it's rock weathering, which is just what it sounds like. So when CO2 goes in the atmosphere, it reacts, and this is a brief little chemistry lesson tonight. The rest of it won't be like this. But when CO2 goes in the atmosphere, it reacts with rainwater. It makes it slightly more acidic. That rainwater rains and literally weathers rocks. It reacts with rocks, and the products of that reaction eventually get delivered out into the ocean, and that, with calcium and all the minerals and rocks. And what was once carbon dioxide in the atmosphere eventually gets precipitated out as calcium carbonate in the ocean, or like chalk or limestone, in little sea creatures like this. So you might have seen these satellite pictures of these big swirls of algae off the coast, which are coccolithophores, or at least a lot of them are, which are these tiny little microscopic phytoplankton that build these shells out of calcium carbonate. So, and then maybe, closer to home and very important for the industry here is oysters pull off the same trick as well. They build their shells out of calcium carbonate. And if you go out west, or you go in where the Olympics are now in Cortina in northern Italy, it's just stacks and stacks of this stuff from deep time, and this is the White Cliffs of Dover, which is made out of coccolithophores. So over time, this is a very big sink of CO2. A little bit of it's coming out of volcanoes, and then a little bit of it's trickling back into the earth. But over time, these huge sources and sinks match each other. And the amazing thing about it, and the reason why it's a thermostat, is that if, for whatever reason in Earth history, volcanoes start putting a lot more of it into the air, it makes it warmer, and you evaporate and precipitate more, and you have a stormier world. And so you have a hotter, stormier world, which is better for weathering rocks, which means the planet gets better at burying carbon. And on the other hand, if for whatever reason volcanoes stop putting as much of it into the air and it gets colder, all these weathering reactions slow down and allow more CO2 to stay in the air and keep it warmer. So it's kind of this amazing, this is why we've never gone off this crazy trajectory over the age of animal life of, freezing the planets the planet to the tropics, or a super greenhouse that would kill everything. We've gotten pretty close in both directions, but in each case, this has managed to save us. The reason why this kind of mechanism doesn't get us off the hook as humans is because, as you can imagine, weathering all the rocks on the planet takes a long time. And so this really operates on 100,000 to 200,000 year timescales. And what we're doing is just too fast. It makes this sort of safety switch irrelevant. And so you do get occasionally terrifying moments in Earth history where more CO2 is going in the air than it can accommodate. And this thermostat can break. It can also break in the other direction, where for whatever reason weathering gets out of control, which is kind of weird to think about. But I talk about one occasion like that in the book, which is this thing so we're jumping 4 billion years in the future here. And there's this thing right before the age of animal life, snowball Earth, which is just what it sounds like. The planet did actually freeze to the tropics. It's really strange that it happens to proceed immediately before the age of animal life. And that's a mystery that I get into the book. But snowball Earth was, it's the most extreme climate catastrophe in Earth history. If you're an alien, it lasted for over 60 million years. If you're an alien visiting Earth, you just think it's like Hoth. You wouldn't think there's much life here. It's just the frozen planet in this weird solar system. The reason why you go into this is CO2 drops below a threshold where the weathering thing is about the breakup of this weird supercontinent. You had very weatherable rocks, and it was a really hot planet at the time. And it just would have been a sort of a black hole for CO2 at the time. CO2 drops below a threshold, and then ice starts building on the poles, and it has to pass this threshold, which is pretty far from the tropics. It's thousands of miles on either side. That if it passes, the planet just gets too bright and starts reflecting so much sunlight back to space that you just have this runaway feedback loop where it completely freezes solid. This popped up in early climate models in the 60s and 70s. They noticed that if they turned the temperature down a little bit, the planet froze solid, but they just assumed this was an artifact of their models, that there's clearly no way this had ever happened in Earth history, because if it did, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. This would have been the end of it for Earth. But weirdly, geologists, like these geologists that I joined in Death Valley, were finding evidence for exactly that it seems like around 700 million years ago, the planet was frozen to the tropics. And what's so cool about geology is very often the place that you see above the rocks today is very different than the story in the rocks. So Death Valley, literally the hottest place on Earth today, you see all this weird glacial rock from 700 million years ago that almost looks like some of the rock in New England, where it's like glacial till, and So I joined these geologists who were there to study snowball Earth, and they were there to study it because they had grants from NASA, weirdly, to study snowball Earth, but it makes sense once you realize that what I said earlier, which is immediately after it, you start getting all these big, weird fossils in the fossil record. And we still don't really know the reason why, like as soon as snowball Earth thaws, after 4 billion years of basically, there's just kind of the most interesting thing on the planet, just sort of microbial muck. The planet goes through this really horrible event, thaws, and then you have this, the champagne cork of like large complex life happens. And if anyone ever has the chance to go to Newfoundland, this is a picture I took at Mistaken Point, which actually has these fossils, is like the earliest site on Earth with large fossil life on Earth, and it's right after this event. So I'll keep the mystery between these two events. I'll keep, if you want to find out that, I'll let you buy the book.
The good promo.
Right? I'm getting better at selling this thing. So there was another time that the planet almost snowballed. It didn't quite get there. And we're going to jump a few hundred million years in the future now to the Carboniferous period, around 315 million years ago. By now, I said animal life started to take off in the last slide. And by now, hundreds of millions of years on, you have a very thriving ecosystem on land and in the ocean. You're still tens of millions of years before the age of dinosaurs. But this is by far my least favorite period in Earth history because this is the age of gigantic insects. Oxygen was really high in the Carboniferous, and so that allowed these insects to you'd have these millipedes that were the size of crocodiles, and dragonflies the size of seagulls, and scorpions the size of golden retrievers. And so I think in the book I say if there's a time machine is like ever invented, this will be the least popular tourist destination. But I think most of you might be more, if you've ever heard of the Carboniferous period, it's because this is where basically all the coal comes from. It's the carbon period, basically. And it's another weird feature of geology that 90% of our coal comes from 2% of its history, mostly in the Carboniferous. And I get into some reasons for why that might be. But this was the alien world that coal miners would encounter in the early 20th century, which is just bizarre because I took I went to Appalachia and walked around with a geologist and got a tour. And you can see in these old coal mines, there's just impressions of trees and ferns in the ceilings. And so you have these, workers going down into the middle of the earth and seeing this, like these ancient swamp forests. And in fact, one of the leading causes of mortality in the early 20th century for mine workers was literally 300 million year old petrified trees falling out of the ceiling and crushing them. So it's just this bizarre encounter with deep time that, industrial society had when we started mining this stuff. And even though it was swampy and rainforesty in the tropics of, Appalachia and England at the time, because the continents have moved around since then, elsewhere on the Earth, there were ice sheets starting to develop at the poles, because you can imagine burying all this carbon in the Earth was a really good way of drawing down CO2. So you have all this swamp forests sucking up all this carbon, and then it's being buried. And so CO2 gets really low in the Carboniferous that even though you do have these sort of rainforests in the tropics, ice is starting to form in the poles. And in fact, so much ice, this period was so good at burying carbon. That's why we, dug it up in the Industrial Revolution. But it was so good at the time at burying carbon that there's some papers that say it almost did snowball. So if you think, okay, if so much CO2 was taken out of the air and turned to carbon and buried in the earth, that it almost glaciated the entire planet, almost dropped you into this snowball state. What would happen if you dug all that coal up and you lit it all on fire in a matter of a few centuries? Obviously, that would do the reverse. It would make things very warm. And so that's the experiment we started running in the 19th century. This is a Monet painting of the British Parliament in the 18-somethings. But I was just struck by this picture because it's so smoggy because it's the Industrial Revolution. So it's giving the sky this sort of purple-orange haze. And when you see paleo art or paintings of like what life was like in the Carboniferous, sometimes the sky kind of looks the same. And that's because with the really high oxygen, you had wildfires in these rainforests nonstop. So the sky was always kind of hazy. And then I had this sort of like light bulb moment when I was like, oh my God, the sky looks the same because it's literally burning the same swamp forest from 300 million years ago in both of these paintings, the one that takes place in the Carboniferous and the one that takes place in the 19th century. But you might think that digging up a lot of coal and burning it at the surface is sort of a unique thing that humans have done. But in fact, the planet has run this experiment before. And for that, we're going to have to jump about 50 million years into the future to something that's a little more recognizable, this age of Pangaea, where all the continents are together, that some of you might be familiar with. Because at the end of sort of this period, the Permian period, you do get something very similar to the Industrial Revolution happens, just in terms of carbon, where these volcanoes burn through tons and tons of coal, which I'll get to. But to introduce you to the world of the Permian, it's sort of this weird world that a lot of us aren't familiar with. If you go to a natural history museum, these are like the rooms that people walk through to get to the dinosaurs, because it's all these weird kind of unrecognizable things that aren't dinosaurs yet, but who knows what they are. They're these gorgonopsins and parasaurs, but you do have an up and running sort of ecosystem on land. Everything in this picture goes extinct at the end of the Permian in this mass extinction. And then in the ocean, this is a picture of the Guadalupe Mountains in West Texas, which I went to. And I went there because a paleontologist told me that if you want to understand what life was like in the Permian period, you should hike up these mountains because it's about as close as you can get to scuba diving in the Permian. Because you notice on your hike, what you're stepping on is, sponge reefs and trilobites and all sorts of cool stuff. One of the best places to see what life was like in the Permian period is at the Permian Basin Petroleum Museum in Midland, Texas, which I went to. And the reason why there's such an amazing diorama of ancient life there is because it left behind $1 trillion of oil when it all fell into the ground. And they also have a Hall of Fame at this museum, and two American presidents are in it, George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. So hats off to them. At the end of the Permian, you get all the stuff in that diorama, essentially. And those weird animals I've shown you before all goes extinct. It's the biggest mass extinction of all time. 252 million years ago, 90% of life on Earth goes extinct. It takes 10 million years for the planet to recover. It's hard to find fossils in the wake of this mass extinction. There's a lot of creepy kind of signatures to it. There's fungus all over the planet after this mass extinction that some people have said is like just things rotting everywhere. So it's really nasty stuff. I talk about this mass extinction in the first and this book because it's so centrally related to CO2. For a long time, people, especially with the success of the asteroid and explaining the dinosaur extinction, went to this one looking for evidence of impacts and they didn't find it. But instead what they found in Russia is all this sort of grayish brown rock everywhere is all lava flows that date exactly to the time of the extinction. If you go to the middle of nowhere in Siberia, you actually see it as these spectacular kind of plateaus. And enough lava erupted and magma intruded into the crust at the end of the Permian, exactly at this mass extinction, that it could cover the lower 48 United States a kilometer deep. So, Yellowstone doesn't even deserve to be in, the same library as talking about this thing. And it would have been like fissure eruptions like in Iceland. It wouldn't be like big, explosive, spectacular ones. It just would have sort of been oozing for tens of thousands of years. But as spectacular as that is, and it's what an insane event that is volcanically, it doesn't explain why things on the other side of the planet at the bottom of the ocean are also going extinct. And for that, you really need the gases that are coming out of these volcanoes. They would have been putting all sorts of horrible stuff into the air for tens of thousands of years. But the mass extinction really starts once it's clear from people who have reconstructed the geology of how they erupted, that once they started burning through one of the biggest coal basins on Earth in Russia, and just injecting all the CO2 into the air, and they ignited huge natural gas and oil deposits and burned through limestone. So they basically would have been acting like industrial society, just at an insane level. Temperature jumps something like 10 degrees C. So today we've warmed 1.5 degrees C, and we're worried about 2 for good reason. And this is like 10 degrees C. There's evidence of, so this is like in the wake of, instead of those beautiful coral reefs after this, you just get like microbial muck all over the planet. And this is in an office of a geologist who was pointing at me like the extinction layers, like right here, where below this is all sort of like trilobite bits and corals and stuff. And then this is just like microbial muck. So way more CO2 than we could ever emit goes into the atmosphere. It warms the planet like 10 degrees C. You acidify the oceans. You do all the things that we're starting to see the first glimmers of. And this event really just shows you how far, like if you keep going down the road we're going, just how dark it can get. So it's It's this sort of, I don't know, ghost story from Earth history, this cautionary tale telling us, these are very powerful levers we're pulling with. This is literally the greatest crisis in the history of life. This I don't want you to look at. This is just to show you we're not just making this up. There's like geochemistry. You can look at isotopes to reconstruct the temperature and blah, blah, blah. So, all right. Now we're gonna skip the entire age of dinosaurs, even though that's everyone's time period, but there's lots of other books about dinosaurs. And climate speaking and Earth system wise, it's kind of boring from my perspective, even though dinosaurs are very neat. But it basically goes from warm to Pangea starts breaking up and the planet's warm to very warm. And then the last 66 million years, so dinosaurs go extinct right here. And you can see that the picture that people have in their minds of the world of dinosaurs is it's jungly and it's warm. And that's basically true. But when they get wiped out, once the impact winter ends, once, basically nuclear Armageddon, gets washed out of the system in a matter of years, then for the next 20 million years, mammals, our ancestors that survived that extinction, basically inherit the greenhouse era of the dinosaurs. So this is the entire age of mammals, and it's in millions of years. And you can see there's this gradual change. And the story of our evolution from the dinosaurs getting wiped out today is the change from a greenhouse world to what is actually a very cold world. And similarly, this is about 1,000 parts per million down to about 180 parts per million of CO2. So it's also a story of a long, slow decline in CO2. So sometimes you'll hear, climate skeptics cherry picking stuff out, being like, well, look, it was a lot warmer and CO2 was a lot higher, and life was happy in the 50 million years ago. And that's true, but it is such a different world than the one that we evolved on. And I'll sort of kind of walk through that. So how do we know it was a lot warmer back then? Well, you find fossils of stuff like this. So this is sort of a hippo thing, and people have described these as sort of like Southeast US cypress swamp forests. The only thing is the fossils of these are found in Ellesmere Island, so literally the furthest north island in Canada. And it would have been at about the same latitude as it is today. So we have this is just complete tundra today. We have no experience of how can you have a rainforest when there's months of polar night? It's just a totally different world. And in the book I interview, Jalen Eberly at the University of Colorado, who takes a helicopter up to Ellesmere every year, and she goes to study the fossils of this thing, because there's literally tree stumps eroding out of the tundra from this rainforest from 50 million years ago. So we know it was a very warm place. There's alligators and palm trees and stuff, and that high up. And then over the course of tens of millions of years, you can see as it gets cooler and cooler, this is when Antarctica first gets an ice sheet. So there's no ice on the planet on this side of this. And then around 35 million years ago, Antarctica gets an ice sheet, keeps getting cooler and cooler until finally around 3 million years ago, CO2 has declined so much and it's gotten so cool that we start going in and out of these really crazy ice ages, which is the world that we evolved in. So this is, you get your woolly rhinoceroses in Europe and sort of the ice ages of, popular imagination. But all life on Earth is evolved for this world that took tens of millions of years to get down to. So for a few examples, baleen whales are thought to have these they got really big right around when it started getting really cold. And it's thought that having these huge stores of energy and these getting huge basically was a good strategy to find uncertain sources of food, but as you go in and out of these volatile ice ages. A lot of plants evolved a form of photosynthesis that's more efficient at lower CO2, a few million years ago. And human beings, we are fundamentally shaped by our we evolved, we started coming down from the trees around here, and then Homo erectus shows up right around here, and then Homo sapiens shows up right around here. So we are fundamentally in this very dark, cold region. And it explains a lot of our history. So we invented fire, which we're kind of the only animal on the planet that needs fire for survival. And it's written in our anatomy. So we have these tiny molars that we don't have to chew up food that long. We have these tiny colons compared to other primates, so we don't have to digest our food that long, or we don't have to spend that much time doing it. Because we've outsourced a lot of our digestion to cooking food. It does a lot of the work of digestion that other animals have to spend all day digesting and foraging food to get enough calories. And with that extra, by outsourcing all that work to fire, it allowed us to invest extra energy in these huge brains, which unlocked language and human culture and technology that you can pass down through generations. And as you can imagine, developing fire in the ice ages was a pretty good way to just stay warm, but it also had all these other incredible benefits that basically make us human. So we are ice age creatures. Everything on the planet is weirdly an ice age creature. You might not think of it as like we still live in the ice ages, but it's pretty rare in Earth history to have one of the continents covered in a mile thick ice sheet. And only 20,000 years ago, as I was saying, there was a mile of ice on top of us here if you had gone back to then. So that's the world that we're evolved for. And if you were suddenly in a matter of decades to bring yourself back into a greenhouse world for which we didn't evolve, like that is a jump, a climate shock that basically you don't ever see in Earth history except for like the big mass extinctions. And then just to zoom in on the last 20,000 years of human history. So this is the last swing out of the ice ages. So here's where it's like a mile of ice on top of us, it's 18,000 years ago, 400 feet lower sea level. And then here's all of recorded history starts right there around 6,000 years ago. And so we've basically, our institutional memory of what the climate should be like is this weird, eerie, flat line. And we really don't have any memory as a species of how volatile the climate can actually be in Earth history. But this allowed societies to stay settled and scale up. And eventually, the Industrial Revolution is a eventual product of these, increasing networks and conflicts between humans. But we take for granted where like agricultural breadbaskets are today and where the shoreline is today. But in Earth history, as one climate scientist puts it, the climate system is an angry beast and we're poking it with sticks, which is a good way to put it, because this is what we're potentially doing, where right now it's about as warm as it's been in the past, 3 million years. We're potentially jumping back to this alien world that predates our species and potentially predates like all evolution of like apes. So, and this is in a matter of decades. So again, you just don't see climate shocks like this in Earth history. And so I sort of think of this as the revenge of the Carboniferous. It's very weird that we're sort of just digging up all the life that has ever lived in Earth history and lighting it all on fire, the surface of the Earth all at once. It's a very weird, uncanny thing we're kind of doing. And I don't think people grapple with like just how strange it is that we burn fossil fuels. And they are in places like this, like Appalachia, where you have these mountaintop removal mines, which I went to, which is sort of life that used to live on land is in coal, but then also starting really in the 20th century, we really started burning oil, which is basically the leftovers of all the sea life that we can find from Earth history, because oil and gas is basically fossilized sea life, and coal is sort of stuff that lives on land. So yeah, I mean, again, just imagine what that would be like to go. I don't think we're going to make it this hot. This actually does require like 10, 12 degrees of warming to get back to a world where you have rainforests in the Arctic. So I don't think we're going to make it that hot. But even making it, a few degrees warmer, 5 degrees warmer, really brings you back to like 15 million years ago in a matter of decades. It's just a really extreme thing that we're doing on the planet. And in my work, I go out with geologists, and sometimes we encounter really big, dramatic events in Earth history, but it's kind of humbling when you're looking at strata and geology that sometimes it's just represented with a line like that. So this is in Italy. This was this thing that happened when the ocean lost a half of its oxygen, and it lasted for 600,000 years, and it caused all these extinctions. And it's one of the biggest disruptions in the history of life on Earth. And 600,000 years here, you see it kind of gets a little weird, and then it goes back to normal. And so sometimes I sort of daydream about, what is the legacy we're going to leave in the rocks? Like, is it going to be just one of these weird boundaries? If you imagine you're a geologist 200 million years in the future or something, and you see our legacy, it's just going to be a weird line in the rocks. If we don't get our act together, it kind of could look like this, where it's like, if you're studying it, you'd think, that's a weird, things really went haywire there for a little bit. But then, we wipe ourselves out and the Earth sort of carries on, and we barely ever knew we were here except for the extinctions that we caused. Or, my hope is that we'll learn to sort of see ourselves as part of sort of these big, live in concert with these geological processes that take, hundreds of thousands of years, and live a little bit more in keeping with how the planet operates. So that's my hope. And with that, I don't know how much time I've taken, but I'll just end there and say thank you, Beth. And maybe with this picture of, this is the Smithsonian's official dig vehicle out in Wyoming, which is one of my favorite cars on earth. This like 75 Suburban that they painted a little dinosaur on. I helped take a lot of pictures of it when I was there. But thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
So I'm going to claim the first question. Listen, you've written a very ambitious book. All the other things that I read about climate change, even the ones that claim to take long to look back about 800,000 years. And there are reasons for that.
Yeah,
You know, ice cores, climate data, what have you. You're looking back not 800,000 years, but 4 billion years. How did you work up the courage to do it?
I think it's because I kind of accidentally backed into writing about climate change because I've always been interested in like planetary science and big cosmic questions. And I mean, that's kind of why I wanted to write the book, is to sort of portray this not just as sort of another event in human history. This is really, we're dealing with like big planetary cosmic stuff. So I don't know. I wanted to write about the evolution of the planet, and I just kept finding that I couldn't do that without putting this thing at the center of the story that just happens to be relevant today in the news. But it more was out of a sense of awe that I wanted to write the book. And actually, I would say that it might sound very gloomy, like there's parts of this book that are very gloomy, and writing about this stuff can be kind of gloomy. But I would say the one overriding sort of feeling I had coming out of writing the book was just sort of a sense of like profound gratitude that like any of us are even alive right now, given how much stuff had to go right in planetary evolution. And I was familiar with that stuff, but then learning about how biology works at the like smallest levels, just like the nanomachinery of the cell that's keeping you alive at every second. It's just like a miracle that we're not just falling apart every like 10 seconds. So I kind of wanted to tell that part of the story, that there is a scary component to it, but there's also this much bigger story that yeah.
Great, thank you. Out in the room, who has a question? Anyone?
I know that was a lot, sorry.
Do we have any questions on Zoom?
Believe it or not, I cut that down quite a bit.
Okay, while you're thinking about them, I'll ask you another question. The mantra that you often hear in climate change is to think globally and act locally. Mm-hmm. You've written a very global story. Mm-hmm. You've stumbled across any lessons in that might help us here in thinking locally? Yeah. So I've said this before, and it's like not good for selling books, but it's true that it's almost not worth thinking about climate change in these big cosmic planetary scale if you want to do something about it, because none of us can affect, it quickly becomes overwhelming. What can we do about it? Do anything about it. But in order to solve the problem, it's going to require, all hands on deck, and it's going to require all sorts of skills and jobs that we don't consider, climate jobs. Like, it's great if you're good at organizing and getting people to vote. Like, that's good. Like, that will be necessary. But we're going to have to double the size of the grid if we want to electrify everything in like the next few decades. So that will require an insane amount of, electrical engineers and welders and all these things that we don't think of as climate jobs. But that will be impossible to pull off the transition without those sorts of skills. So it's really find the pressure point, whatever thing you can, whatever lever you think you can push, however small. I do think that is the right way to view it. And then sort of in your, if you want to think about it and read this book, that's cool too. But it's not necessarily the best way to fix it. Great, good. Thank you. Anyone else? Did anyone think of any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes I think the long view is clearly what this book is about, is one reason that people who understand the climate crisis is happening but are okay with it continuing to happen. Because the blip in your strat on that last slide, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's not much that can happen. It's just going to be a blip and keep going.
Well, I mean,
Like, might as well, like, let's burn it now.
Yeah.
We've got it.
Right, but I mean, you don't get to live on geological time. You only get to live like on a decadal time scale
Yeah.
and take care, be a good steward of the planet over here. And I mean, I think that would be incredibly embarrassing as a species if we're just like this brief blip that destroy, like trashes the place and then disappears. But I
think our memory is so short
yeah,
as an individuals that leaving it for somebody even in the future, even thinking back few generations, we have a hard time reconciling that.
Yeah.
It's not what I propose.
Yeah.
But it's something that I've had arguments with people
Yeah.
before.
I can only talk from personal experience that I got extra concerned about climate change once I really started to appreciate this deep time view, because you'll hear people say things like 50 million years ago was warmer, but until you understand how long ago that is and how rare events like what we're doing on the planet are today, where you'll hear people talk about the Little Ice Age in the 1600s. Mm-hmm. It's like the Little Ice Age was less than a half a degree, and it was nothing. It's just not even talking about, we've already blown past that. And in order to find anything remotely similar to what we're doing, you have to go back tens of millions of years. And even those are improper analogs. So like the Permian mass extinction, literally the worst thing that's ever happened. The total volume of CO2 that was eventually released was a lot more than probably we'll ever release. We're doing it at a rate that, as far as we can tell, is 10 times faster than that, the CO2, the emissions of CO2. And for things like ocean acidification, it's the rate that really matters, because it's just, it acidifies faster. And given that was one of the kill mechanisms in that mass extinction, like that for me really like scares me. And I know to get people to act, you're not supposed to, like, there's debates about whether you should scare them or give them I try to navigate that line, but I know it was effective for me to get the pants scared off me about climate change. And for me, it was effective learning about the geological time scale. But yeah, there is this sort of nihilistic way of looking at it too, that, well, everything will be fine in a million years. And right, and that's probably true, but it's no consolation to all the species that we're wiping out at the moment, and misery we're making for other human beings. So,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question. Peter, that was great. Thank you. My question is.
Sorry for the rough start.
Great. Good. So with all the politics within the, I don't even know what you want to call it, the language around climate change and things like that, I'm curious to know, when you're out in public, sharing your story about CO2, and I'm curious to know, have you been to the outside of New England? I guess maybe I'll frame. Yeah. So it was rhetorical, but what do you receive when you sort of, because I think the piece that, your book doesn't say this is a book about climate change, it has, so I'm curious to know.
Well, I really like writing about this topic, not necessarily because I love writing about climate change, but I think a lot of it is that I love geology and I love paleontology. And I think that comes from me loving science fiction as a kid, that when you learn science fiction, it's like all these cool animals used to live here. And I've actually found that writing about these ancient events that happened hundreds of millions of years ago, I think a lot of people have their minds made up about, climate change is this thing on computer models and it's theoretical for the future. But certain people have been very receptive to, because they haven't heard about it in this way, that there are rock outcrops you can go to, and if you're a clever geochemist, to actually figure out what happened on the planet, and see what happened to the life on Earth at the time.
And it becomes personal. It's a connection.
Yeah, but I've got emails from oil geologists who they didn't quite admit defeat, but they went about as far as they were comfortable with, because they would say, I've heard a lot about climate change, but I never heard about it. I know these rocks you're talking about, and you've given me a lot to think about. And I was like, oh, that's like, that's fun. So it's sort of, writing about Earth time and deep time, for some people, it's, not to put it in like nefarious terms, but sort of like a Trojan horse for getting to think about climate change in a way that, this issue that they thought they had already made their mind up about. So for me, it's had this added benefit of kind of been strategically good about.
Yeah, it's great.
Great. Ruth, do you have something online?
Yeah, one question is, if you could have us take away one aha moment from the book, what would it be?
some of the origin of life stuff I talked about at the beginning was really kind of mind blowing for me. Because there's this older story of the origin of life that, and again, this has no relevance to climate at all. I just think it's cool. But there's the older story where there's a warm little pond somewhere, and then you just get sort of this miraculous replicating molecule somehow, and then life somehow. Turns out there probably wasn't any land at the time to put a warm little pond because the oceans were about twice as deep. And there was no ozone layer, so just tons of UV radiation and or asteroids all the time. But at these vents, which were protected and down at the bottom of the ocean, the conditions were just perfect, and it reframed life as this, rather than this chance miracle that happened, this necessary chemistry, that you had like frustrated chemistry at the bottom of the ocean, and life came along to like dissipate that energy. So it makes it a necessity rather than like a miracle, and it also raises the chances of if the conditions are similar, you don't need a miracle somewhere else. That in the book, I make an analogy to hurricanes. So in hurricanes, you have this heat that's frustrated in the upper ocean. And then you get these self-organizing complex things that organize out of nowhere to dissipate that heat and spread it across the planet and radiate it a lot out to space. And life is just another thing like hurricanes that came along, only instead of like water, like hurricanes, it works through carbon chemistry to dissipate this energy. So that was just like this mind-blowing moment for me thinking about life that way. That isn't to say life's job is just to dissipate energy. That makes it sound too makes it sound boring. But that was my aha moment.
Good. Any other questions?
You had so the recent graphs that you showed the temperature and how it changed, in the last million years. But I think that from what I understand, what you're saying, and especially that last little blow up of where we are now, it wasn't so much what the temperature is; it's the rate of change.
Yeah.
So this rate of
this is about as fast. This is the deglaciation from sea level jumps up 400 feet until it basically stops around like the beginning of recorded history. But we were around here. This is like humans about 200,000 years ago, and this is only 20,000 years ago. And this is about as fast as things naturally change.
Okay.
Like the deglaciation was unbelievably fast. You have catastrophic floods in the Pacific Northwest you can still see evidence of, and drowned coral reefs now like hundreds of feet underwater that sea level would jump by tens of feet every few centuries. And so this is about as chaotic as it gets. And so that is another thing. Yeah, I should have emphasized that this, like just a straight line up, is we haven't really felt the effects of it yet, and potentially if we get our act together and bring it back down soon again, hopefully like the Earth won't notice. But if we just keep it up high, we can suspect that the changes on the scale of like the last ice age to now will happen.
Other questions? Anything online? No? Everybody's quiet. Okay, well, this has been a great evening and a great event. Remember, everyone, if you have thoughts for future events you'd like to see, fill out our form, sign up if you'd like. I'm sure Terry is happy to help you in the remaining time if you'd like a copy of the book autographed by Peter. Yeah. And with that, thank you very much.